Okay, this is Chapter 1 of State and Local Government. Spend a few minutes here introducing ourselves to what state and local governments have to deal with. State government operates separately from central or federal government. That's what we call our system of federalism. And we'll be talking about that in considerably more detail in the next chapter. Now, state and local governments deal with lots of things. We'll talk about why that is. A lot is delegated down to the states for them to handle. These are some of the major issues that states have to deal with as far as what they're delegated to do. And their delivery of these services is limited in certain ways, partly because they have to raise the revenue for these services as they are used, because the states cannot run a deficit. Feel free to pause and look at these slides, as I probably will not read all of them. I'm following along with the book here, and if I'm expanding on something that the book does not talk about, I will let you know that. In many cases, I'm going along with the book. As we see here, particularly since World War II, state and local government percentage of manpower in government has increased quite a bit, while federal government is kind of retracted a lot. So that's part of this federalist concept of devolving it back down to the states, where the states will handle more things, and they of course will delegate things down to the cities and counties, that sort of thing. As far as what the states spend their money on, here's some numbers. Health care is the biggest chunk that states spend their money on, and then taking it down a little bit further to the local spending as far as cities, municipalities, whatnot. Education is the biggest bulk of spending for local governments. We'll look at that in more detail later on. Since states cannot run a deficit and they are increasingly tasked with doing more things for people, they have had to improve their revenue streams over the years with variety of things such as user charges, various types of taxes, sales taxes. Some states have income taxes. When the economy is going good, they'll set aside rainy day funds. There's new innovations out there as far as raising money, particularly with legalizing gambling, lotteries, racing, horse racing, things like that. And they have to get increasingly creative in order to keep raising revenues. So the book talks about some interesting ideas that states and local governments have been doing to try to keep raising revenue in order to provide these services for their citizens. And the states have had to expand their scope of operations, in part because it's delegated down to them to take care of it, but in some cases it's because the federal government is having increasingly difficult getting things passed as far as on a national basis. So there's just various assorted things that states and localities will deal with as far as how to improve their standards of living for their citizens, whether it's even things such as initiating Amber Alerts or city bike systems, things like that. Now, one of the things about our state system is that states can learn from each other, and this is called the diffusion effect, where one state does something, another state sees that might be a good idea. So again, lots of ideas out there of things that are innovated or enacted in one state that might have some success. Other states might look at that and look at that as well. Again, rather than going through all these in detail, you can actually look in the book at some of the examples of some things that states are doing to improve citizens' standards of living, safety, whatever it may be. And the states are tasked to handling their own criminal codes and safety and health regulations for their state, but there is increasing interstate or interjurisdictional cooperation between states, interstate compacts, which is mentioned in the Constitution, which we'll talk about here in the next chapter. Before we really get into federalism, we need to review the Constitution. For example, the New York-New Jersey Port Authority is an interstate compact that handles the bridge and tunnel traffic and that sort of thing. There's another issue is that states have had to kind of come together in order to collect taxes on the internet, whereas since when the internet first came out, that was undefined as to which state would be taxed for which revenue. So that had to be pursued. States coming together in order to collect considerable amount of lost revenue on sales taxes through internet sales. And this is relevant to your topic. We're starting to see increased national versus state conflict. Our federalist system was designed for a reason. We'll talk about that in Chapter 2. And the states are delegated to take care of their own business for the most part, but the federal government has final authority. So there's lots of issues out there that each state's tackle on their own, and they may be butting heads with what the federal government may actually be wanting to do or trying to do. So your paper topic will be looking at that. Find an interesting issue. There's lots of them out there. I'll probably post something on Moodle that gives you lots of ideas. I would like each student to have a separate topic to look at, analyze that topic as to why states are pursuing it and what the conflict is between the state and the federal government. And we know that the federal government will eventually supersede any state policy, particularly if U.S. Congress passes a law, everybody has to abide by that, or if the U.S. Supreme Court hands down a decision, all the other state courts have to deal with that. But there's lots of issues out there where there's some push and pull, give and take, that sort of thing. Unfunded mandates are when the federal government requires the states to do something but does not provide funding for them. That's kind of a sore spot. Environmental disputes, we know that the environment is becoming a global issue, not just the United States or just a state issue. So there's going to be some issues there where some states are pursuing environmental regulations, whereas the federal government may not, that sort of thing. Various court cases would provide lots of interesting examples of, for example, the health care. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get into healthcare policy. The ACA is the Affordable Care Act. And some states were pushing back against that on the requirement to expand Medicaid coverage. So there's lots of good things out there to look at, to investigate, to write your paper on. And of course, I'll be talking more about the paper and guideline for writing that pretty soon. Now, states, local governments have to deal with fiscal stress. That means financial stress because they cannot run a deficit. They have to raise the amount of funds that they spend, and particularly since the recession in 2008, we've been on our way out of that for a few years now, but it was a pretty big impact. The rainy day funds were tapped into. There was a lot of cutting of spending, particularly of social services such as teachers and things like that. And most states cut certain types of things. You can read those there. You can also follow up in the book. City services were cut in various ways. And then at the same time, fees were increased in order to make up for what was still needed to be done. So states will constantly have to deal with this in providing services for their citizens, but also having to raise the revenue to provide that. We are seeing some conflict between the states as well because some states have more advantages than others. Texas and California, for example, are more attractive, particularly as we were coming out of the recession. We even saw that in North Dakota, where the natural gas industry just exploded, had some advantages there. So the states might actually cry to federal government to provide some relief or provide some competition there so that other states can hopefully get in on economic development when some states have more advantages. And we know that we'll talk about this more as well, but because states are literally competing with each other for jobs and businesses, states can sweeten the deals by providing tax breaks or relaxing regulations and things like that. This results in bidding wars, incentive packages, below cost land, tax concessions, subsidized job training. So those are some examples of states do to try to attract businesses to their state in competition with other states when those businesses would land somewhere in the United States anyway. This is a website that literally talks about how my little hometown outside of Austin, Texas, was competing for the big Amazon campus there. And this just shows some of the problem with this interstate competition is that Amazon did eventually decide to come to New York City, and then there was some pushback on that, and then they literally changed their mind and pulled out. And so Amazon did take a hit publicity wise as far as going through all this competition between states when some scholars felt that that's probably where they would have gone anyway, even without all the competition, and that they were probably looking for a sweeter deal somewhere, or at least to go where they intended to go in the first place, but yet get a much sweeter deal with a lot less cost to them in order to set up shop there. So that's a potential problem there that states competing against each other for economic development. And we do know that since we've gotten out a couple of wars in the Middle East, now that doesn't mean that our military involvement could pick back up again. But military base closures is also an issue that states have to deal with, whereas may close in one state but not close in another state. We also still have to deal with the fact that human beings are running the shows, political corruption. There's some examples of things that some states in the past decade or so have had to deal with as far as political corruption goes. Now, as far as the people in government, the state and local governments do seem to make a more of an attempt to have their governments represent the population at large a little bit more. I think there's still, even on the state and local levels, depending on where we are, depending on what we're looking at, there's still a disparity. But in 2010 census there, we see that these are the breakdowns of ethnic groups in the United States, and the Hispanic population is increasing, and we see that in most demographic predictions there by 2050, the white population will be less than 50% of the population. And, and that has some political ramifications as well that might be inspiring some of the anti-immigrant sentiment, that sort of thing. Speaking of which, the undocumented immigrants has become even more an issue under the current Trump administration. And yes, we have to weigh these costs and benefits of illegal immigrants. Clearly, there's rules procedures for people to come in if they're needed for employers to hire, then avenues can be made to do that. So that's just another issue that states are having to deal with. We also see that the U.S. population in general is shifting generally from the Northeast to the South and Southwest, so to speak. We got some numbers here we can look at. You can see how, particularly in the first decade of this century here, we see how some states had pretty dramatic increases there, while some states, such as Michigan, had a decline in population. But states like Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Texas, and let me take a look at Florida. Florida and Georgia, yes, pretty high. Even Idaho, interestingly enough, had pretty major gains in populations, whereas in the Northeast, we starting to see some decreases here. This is just a progression as we go over the past 30 years or so, and these are the numbers that we just looked at here. And if you want to look at a little bit more recent one, this is from the book, Percent Change in Population from 2000 to 2014. So this was kind of a mid-census update here. So you can see the biggest gains here are in the southern states in general, overall Texas and Florida, and Colorado, and of course North Dakota. I even mentioned that, how they had a dramatic pickup because of their natural gas availability there that really provided quite a bit of jobs in that area. But as you can see, the states that are growing the slowest, maybe even losing, are up here in the Rust Belt, so to speak, and up here in the Northeast. So we see some demographic shifts here in the United States as well, because that means that representation is also shifting as well. Southern states that are getting more population will have more representatives in government, things like that. We're also seeing that states are somewhat dividing. This is what we call the red and blue state divide, that starting to see disagreements over certain cultural issues, as far as where, particularly in highly metropolitan areas, you may start seeing more liberal leaning attitudes. There's some logic behind that, where people who are living in large metropolitan areas are a little bit more acceptable to diversity and law and order, as far as making sure that the government is providing safe environment in these highly diverse populated areas. Whereas in the rural population, not as much interaction, still more traditional values, religion, less, I guess you could say, less tolerant of diversity, things like that. So we're starting to see that divide out pretty interestingly in the states as well. That gives us some other things to look at. And but our federal system, competition is part of what drives it. We've talked about the innovation that states can enact that literally could spread to other states, and if it's a great idea, then even it might spread nationwide. The federal government could adopt it, that sort of thing. So the policy is not always going top down. It could be going from state on up, and because of this, what we call this laboratory of democracy, with these 50 states that are also tasked with taking care of their citizens. So federalism is the concept upon which our United States system works. We'll talk about that more in detail. Federalism is defined generally that the national government operates separately from state government. So it's two layers, I guess you could say, but of course there's a lot of interaction, pushback, give and take, that sort of thing. And bottom line, the national government has final authority, but at the same time, it delegates a lot of powers down to the state governments for them to take care of. Here's just some additional websites that you could check out. But that concludes Chapter 1, so we'll get into Chapter 2, Federalism, here shortly, and we'll also review the U.S. Constitution.